Hello and good evening, everybody. My name is Alex Linz, and I am a planner with the Department of City Planning. We're going to begin the workshop for the draft wildlife ordinance in just a few minutes and give people a little bit more time to join us. And I want to remind everyone quickly that if you have not received a copy of the draft wildlife ordinance, it can be viewed or downloaded from our website. You can visit the website at planning4la.org/wildlife. That's planning, the number 4la.org/wildlife. And this information will also be shared with all attendees via the chat box. The first 15 minutes of today's meeting is devoted to a pre-recorded staff presentation. Following the presentation, staff will be sharing answers to some commonly asked questions. And following the commonly asked questions presentation, we've reserved time for questions and answers, a Q&A session. So you can use the questions box in the GoToWebinar platform to add your questions, and staff will organize them and respond to as many as we can during our Q&A. We'd also like to note that no decisions regarding the project will be made or finalized during this meeting, and that this meeting is intended for informational purposes only, for us to share and to receive information about the project. So thanks very much for attending. As I mentioned, we're going to give people just a couple more minutes to join us, and then the workshop will begin shortly. I see that people are still joining us. We're going to give just a couple more minutes before we start with the rest of the presentation materials. Okay, we're going to get started. People will trickle in, but we'll be sharing this information. And if there are any questions, please feel free to use the chat box. So hello, welcome everybody. We're very pleased you could join us this evening. My name is Alex Linz, and I am a planner with the Department of City Planning. And I'm also joined in this meeting by my fellow colleagues who are working on the project, Connie Polini, Lena Mick, and Kat Superfisky, as well as some other staff people who have generously agreed to help us on the back end here. So Before we get started, we are pleased to be able to share a brief video with some opening remarks from Councilman Paul Koretz. Give me 1 second to pull that up.
Hi, I'm Councilmember Paul Koretz, and I'm very excited to be here in the hills over Mulholland to announce the first draft coming out of our wildlife ordinance. This will be designed to protect wildlife that many people don't even know are here in our hillsides. Mountain lions and bobcats and deer. But developments are blocking off their ways of passing and meeting each other. Animals are becoming more inbred, and every time there's a development that blocks off a corridor, it makes it harder and harder for our wildlife to survive. In addition to protecting our wildlife and protecting their habitat, this also helps us maintain our natural resources, clean our air. It has so many values. It will help us with climate change. It will help us keep more of our tree canopy. So this is a win-win-win in every possible way. We are starting with a pilot program here in the hillsides where we are. There was also an amendment to this motion by Paul Krikorian so that we expanded to the whole rim of the valley. We hope that will then connect all the way out to Ventura County on the west, much further east as well within the city of Los Angeles and beyond. And we can save all of our wildlife by taking this step. So we couldn't be more excited to announce this here in the heart of the hillsides where our animals and their habitat are. We're just so excited. We thank the mayor and everyone else who was involved in this in any way to make this happen. I particularly want to thank Vince Bertoni, the head of our planning department, and for his staff for all of their good work. This is truly exciting. We are going to save our wildlife, and it's so exciting for us to be able to declare that here today.
Well, we certainly appreciate the councilperson's kind remarks. I'm bringing back our presentation now. So the purpose of today's virtual meeting is to provide, again, an overview of the draft wildlife ordinance, to share responses to some of the commonly asked questions that we have received, and to clarify some questions that have been submitted to us to date. And we'll also provide an opportunity to collect additional feedback and answer additional questions related to the proposed ordinance. We'd like to note again that decisions will not be made during this session and that it's just for informational purposes. But we appreciate the input and we encourage you to use the question box. So here you'll see the GoToWebinar control panel. We want to take a minute to go through the instructions. To ask a question, type it into the questions box in your GoToWebinar event controls. And please also note that as an attendee, you're automatically muted for the duration of the presentation. We have a lot of people who have RSVP'd for this. But this presentation will be recorded and it will be available on our website in the coming weeks. So again, you can find that at planningforla.org/wildlife. And this information will be shared with attendees in the chat box. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please reach out via the questions box. You can also call a staff person at 213-978-1391. Again, that number is 213-978-1391 if you have technical issues during the presentation. And at the end of this pre-recorded video that we will share, there'll be a presentation from the staff on commonly asked questions. And again, following that will be an additional Q&A session. So this video is going to review a little bit of the background and the basic information on the wildlife pilot study and the proposed wildlife ordinance, which may not have been seen previously by some of our attendees. Please remember, you can begin typing in your questions at any time.
Cities are often seen as urban or developed areas composed of concrete, steel, and infrastructure. But cities, such as Los Angeles, are helping to set a precedent for how to address some of the most essential conservation strategies within the most developed parts of the world. There are many different efforts underway across the region and state to identify and address the need for more connected landscapes that enhance biodiversity. One local example is the National Park Service's research effort to track and monitor mountain lion subpopulations. Research such as this is informing the need for enhancing and reconnecting habitats around and through urban areas, since without these key connections, key species such as the mountain lion could become locally extinct in as few as 15 to 20 years. There are a multitude of other efforts underway to address ecological health in the Los Angeles region, some of which are being spearheaded by the City of LA. These plans, reports, and projects include such efforts as the City of LA's general plan, which includes a specific conservation element, the City of LA's Green New Deal, the Bureau of Sanitation and Environment's One Water, Biodiversity, and Healthy Soils initiatives, and the City of LA's first step towards an urban forest management plan, among many others. Managing ecosystems in urban areas is essential to enhancing biodiversity, addressing climate change, and providing general resilience on a global scale. Many people may be surprised to know that wildlife can be found in many corners of the city, not only in public parks or open spaces. In urban settings, more than a third of green space is actually found in backyards and on private property. People may think that the Santa Monica Mountains are already protected open space areas within the city, but in reality, the land in the Santa Monicas is made up of many different individual properties, some of which are held by the city as public open space or by conservancies or public trusts for the community. However, most land is held by individual property owners and is zoned or built for housing. This fact highlights the importance of managing land on private property so that individuals can play a part in enhancing the environment for the benefit of all Angelenos.
The Wildlife Pilot Study is an effort that the Planning Department initiated in response to a motion by City Council member Paul Koretz of Council District 5 to create an ordinance with a set of land use regulations that would preserve wildlife connectivity in the city. The overall goal of the proposed regulations is to balance wildlife habitat with private property development in order to achieve more sustainable outcomes in the city's hillsides. By ensuring that such development takes place in a more sustainable manner, the city can help to address and support other essential goals such as biodiversity, climate resilience, fire safety, and watershed health. Once adopted, it is intended that the regulations being proposed for the Wildlife Pilot Study area would eventually be expanded to all PAWs throughout the city. In addition to aligning existing city regulations and other jurisdictions' best practices, the wildlife team coordinated feedback within the department's divisions. The proposed wildlife standards take into account existing planning departments' efforts, including updates to the Protected Tree Ordinance, the proposed Ridgeline Ordinance, and community plan updates such as the Hollywood and Southwest Valley plans updates. In addition, the wildlife team have been coordinating with other city departments such as Bureau of Sanitation and Environment, Department of Building and Safety, Urban Forestry, LA City Fire Department, Department of Water and Power, and Bureau of Engineering. The proposed regulations are meant to align with parallel regional efforts while complementing existing hillside city regulations. For instance, properties in the pilot study are subject to the baseline hillside ordinance, the hillside construction regulations, the Mulholland specific plan, and regulations associated with underlying zones. New regulations would work together with existing regulations to meet objectives for wildlife. The proposed regulations would enhance wildlife habitat and connectivity by considering factors that influence wildlife health and mobility, such as proximity to large open spaces, sensitive vegetated areas, and the presence of water. Features that may impede wildlife movement, such as land use patterns that result in fencing and structures which create barriers to movement for wildlife, were also taken into consideration. Proposed regulations include yard setbacks, resource buffer requirements, fencing requirements, lot coverage rules, slope and grading rules, vegetation and landscaping standards, and new standards for windows, lighting, and trash enclosure. Proposed regulations would limit structures that are allowed to be built within setback areas to preserve space between properties. Proposed rules for front, rear, and side yards also include a cumulative setback option, which would maintain existing requirements for yard setbacks, but allow properties to combine their front and rear yards or their side yards, so long as minimum setbacks are met. Fencing and wall structures are commonly constructed to enclose yard setbacks. Certain fencing locations and designs can prevent wildlife from safely passing between important habitat areas. The proposed fencing regulations would require fences, walls, or privacy screens to be located outside of setback areas unless they are wildlife friendly. Developments may have negative effects on habitat areas through the increase of impervious surface areas. Impervious surfaces are any material that prevent passage of water into the underlying soils and create runoff. The proposed lot coverage limits would reduce the amount of impervious surface areas on site in order to control drainage and increase water percolation. To help reduce the overall impervious surfaces in the hillside, the proposed regulations would assign lot coverage maximums based on lot size. Impervious surfaces such as building footprint of a primary structure, accessory structures, hardscape features such as decks, garages, pools, tennis courts would also be counted towards the lot coverage maximums. Grading and other improvements alter vegetation and topography and result in the loss of vegetation. Grading on very steep slopes presents additional challenges to fire safety and to preserving hillside terrain. The proposed slope and grading rules aim to minimize the removal and disturbance of biological resources, to minimize terrain modification, land disturbance, and alteration of topographic and geologic features, to reduce erosion and maintain mature hillside vegetation and trees, to minimize fire hazard by limiting alteration and development on steep slopes, to reduce the potential for overall loss of soil and support functional wildlife movement and connectivity, and finally, to preserve the natural setting and scenic characteristics of the Santa Monica Mountains. The current hillside development rules recognize steep slopes as one of many variables necessary to determine the size of development that can occur on a property. With the proposed ordinance, structures would not be permitted to be sited by right where portions of a lot are sloped 100% or more. Additionally, the regulations proposed would reduce the overall allowable by right grading amount based on slope steepness. These restrictions would limit disturbance to vegetation and soil, minimizing disruption to existing habitat and wildlife on site. One of the goals of the wildlife study is to protect natural resources for wildlife habitat. The next regulation helps in this regard by proposing buffers around sensitive resources such as streams, wetlands, riparian corridors, ridgelines, and open spaces. The regulation would propose a 50-foot buffer when resources are identified on site, meaning construction would be restricted within the buffer. Grading or construction activities occurring within the 50-foot buffer would require additional development review. Native and drought-tolerant landscaping offer multiple benefits for biodiversity. They are water efficient, support local plant and animal habitat, and can prevent erosion and runoff. The regulations proposed are intended to help to retain native trees as well as mature trees, to preserve rare species that are difficult to replace, such as the black walnut, to create safer environments to protect against fire hazards, and to improve watershed health. The proposed regulations would extend tree protection beyond the current protected tree ordinance to also affect mature trees, whether native or non-native. Such trees would be considered significant, and removal would require them to be replaced with native trees at a ratio of 2:1. The removal of dead trees would also require replacement. In addition, landscaping projects would be required to select species from a preferred native plant list that includes species suitable for the Santa Monica Mountains climate. Planting requirements would also need to align with fire-safe planting zones. The proposed regulations would also prohibit planting invasive species, which can diminish biodiversity and contribute to fire hazards. The proposed window standards would improve avian safety conditions by reducing avian injuries and death caused by reflective and transparent windows or other building design elements. Proposed standards include requiring windows and freestanding glass walls and facades to be treated with bird-safe treatment to prevent bird injury. Many suitable options include fritted, frosted, stenciled, and UV reflective glass, as well as architectural features such as overhangs, awnings, screens, nets, or other elements that layer, recess, or otherwise structurally break up large expanses of reflective or transparent surfaces, which can result in injury or death to birds that mistakenly collide with those untreated surfaces. Using the appropriate night lighting and less illumination can promote and maintain dark skies for the health and enjoyment of individuals and animals. The proposed trash enclosure standard would minimize occurrences of human-wildlife interaction by removing attractive nuisances in unenclosed trash areas. The regulations proposed are intended to work holistically to provide the strongest protection in areas most sensitive in the hillsides and most important for the health of habitats and associated wildlife. By implementing this ordinance first in the pilot study area in the Santa Monica Mountains, the city can determine if these set of regulations are adequate to achieve the intended outcomes. Following up the pilot study area implementation, the regulations are planned to be extended to other areas such as the proposed pause, as described earlier.
Okay, that concludes that video update or the video reminder for those of our attendees who are already familiar with some of that information. I'm going to bring back our slide presentation and we can continue with our updated project information.
So while Alex brings up slide 6, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Connie Polini-Tipton, and I'm the senior city planner working on this project. So good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening. We are so pleased you have chosen to participate this evening. As of just a few minutes ago, I see that we have 127 participants. So we thank you for being here this evening. We know you have other items and family members to attend to, so we will try to keep this to an hour and a half and try to answer as many questions as we can in the Q&A session. Before we get to that session, we want to thank you for providing your input and feedback on the draft ordinance so far. And we'd like to take this opportunity in part 2 of this webinar to clarify some common questions and or comments that have already been submitted to the city during the initial review and comment period. And we look forward to gathering more of your questions and comments today during the virtual webinar. After we provide an overview to some of those common questions and common comments, we will be taking additional questions and comments until the end of today's workshop. I would also like to note that feedback will be collected through a series of audience participation questions that we will be asking you throughout this workshop. And now we will transition to answering the questions that we have heard thus far from our initial public review of the ordinance. The planning department is charged with regulating land uses and has the responsibility of zoning land to provide guidance for its development and protection. This is done chiefly through the zoning code and ordinances, such as the proposed wildlife ordinance that is the topic of today's meeting. A typical ordinance contains the following components: an intent statement or a statement of purpose. Why is the ordinance adopted or proposed? An establishment of the district or a description of the boundary map that describes where the ordinance provisions apply. Definitions of terms, if different than or in addition to the municipal code. And in this ordinance, they're listed on pages 1 through 5 of the ordinance. Another component is how regulations work with other zoning. In this case, the proposed regulations are written to be more restrictive than other existing regulations and are stated to supersede those. Regulations by topic contain the standards for development that work to achieve the objectives in the intent statement. Pages 5 through 17 is where the regulations are listed. Rules of measurement. This is a new section that is proposed by the Recode update and specifies the metrics by which some standards are measured. These are found on page 18. The relief section typically describes the process by which an applicant can request relief from the standards, located on page 19. And then appendices, which include a boundary map, a resources map, design guidelines, and plant lists. So now that you are familiar with the components of the ordinance, a logical follow-on question we have been asked is, how will this ordinance be implemented? Please cue there we go, thank you. The graphic on this slide shows the proposed approach for implementation. Standards with objective measurements such as fencing placement, lot coverage calculation, proximity to resource buffers, slope location, and grading quantities, window size and treatment, lighting locations, and trash enclosures can be reviewed and permitted by the Department of Building and Safety through a permit process. Standards such as those that require compliance with the intent of achieving a wildlife-friendly fence per the criteria in the ordinance, alternative setback configurations, and vegetation landscaping compliance can be reviewed by the Planning Department through an administrative clearance. Other standards that require an interpretation of the rules or that cannot be met by a project will be handled through a discretionary review or entitlement application. This entitlement process would be anticipated for when a development project cannot avoid a resource buffer, slope development, or grading maximum, is larger than the specified site plan review threshold, or simply cannot meet other standards. Another question we have received comes in the form of a request. Members of the public have requested more time to review the ordinance. The good news is that there is definitely time to provide feedback and suggestions. This slide shows where we are in the review and adoption process. We requested initial public feedback for the end of May so we could help clarify questions and begin to integrate additional suggestions into the draft ordinance. Suggestions, concerns, and public comments will inform the version of the draft ordinance that is heard next at public hearing. The graphic shows we will accept public comment throughout the review and adoption process, including through the formal staff level hearing, City Planning Commission hearing, and the City Council hearing. An approval process through which the regulations would be anticipated to be adopted in late 2021. The public is encouraged to submit comments and questions early in this process, so there is time to incorporate and adjust based on concerns or suggestions made. Comments are still welcome throughout the process. Earlier comments are most likely to be integrated and responded to. So you may continue to provide feedback and share suggestions tonight at upcoming hearings and/or by submitting written comments to our la2040@lecity.org. And we can provide that email address in the chat as well. So next slide, we have a few more commonly asked questions to share. But first, we would like to involve the audience a bit more actively. We have a handful of questions for our participants. The first is to understand the level of support for the ordinance and its various components. I will now ask the first audience participation question. Please indicate your level of support for the wildlife ordinance as it is currently written. And we're going to give people a few moments to respond. And I'm showing that people are still voting, so I'm not going to close quite yet. Thank you for participating. We have a majority of respondents sharing their feelings about the ordinance, so I'm not going to close the poll quite yet. We'll give you a few more minutes. If this is your first time participating in the webinar, it might take a moment to figure out where to put in your response. All right, I think that we have the majority of participants who are interested in sharing their feelings for this ordinance, and we have about 50% of respondents indicating support. And sorry, we're showing you the responses. Just over 50% are supportive, 10%, about 10% are neutral, about just under 20% are not supportive currently, and 20% are maybe waiting to find out a little bit more. So thank you so much for participating in our first poll. I'm now going to introduce my colleague, Lena Mick, who will be presenting the next commonly asked question.
Thank you, Connie. Hi, everyone. Welcome. A question that we commonly receive is, how was the boundary of the Wildlife Ordinance District determined? The proposed Wildlife Ordinance District was first identified by Councilman Corrett's office in a motion that directed the Planning Department to propose land use protections for wildlife connectivity in the Santa Monica Mountains. The study and staff research resulted in the boundary as currently proposed. And in the initial stage of developing the ordinance, protected areas for wildlife, PAWS, were identified by a team of biologists hired by the city to conduct a citywide assessment of areas that potentially contain ecological resources and sensitive habitats. Using GIS, environmental databases, and field work, the PAWS were identified as places containing pristine habitat, valuable for preserving and promoting wildlife connectivity. Factors that influence wildlife movement, such as proximity to large open spaces, proximity to the county significant ecological areas, SEAs, as well as areas with sensitive or intact vegetation communities were considered. Land use patterns or development patterns that pose barriers that prevent wildlife movement were also considered in identifying the PAWS. A report was produced from this initial evaluation, and resulting recommendations were taken into account when developing the Wildlife Ordinance District boundary. And as illustrated in this image, the Wildlife Ordinance District is geographically situated in the middle of the Santa Monica mountain range, serving as a critical connection area for these and other wildlife in the region. The maps show the wildlife connectivity not just in the Santa Monica Mountains, but of the San Gabriel's, Simis, Verdugos, and the Santa Monica Mountains region as a whole. The next slide shows the ordinance is proposed to be applied to the entire geographic area located within the Wildlife Ordinance District boundary, formerly referred to as the Wildlife Pilot Study Area, which encompasses the area between the 101 and 405 freeways in the Santa Monica Mountains. The proposed boundary was verified using GIS to combine data from different sources. In the end, several criteria were used to determine the final boundary, including the proposed pause, places of very high fire severity zone, hillside terrain and hillside construction boundaries, the county's SEAs, proximity to large open spaces, water resources, and vegetation coverage. Additionally, maps of proposed wildlife connectivity and corridors provided by the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy were reviewed for consistency. Finally, the ordinance district boundary follows census tract boundaries and land use zones for practicality of implementation. Next, my colleague Alex Lenz will walk through the interactive GIS map of the Wildlife Ordinance District boundary that was developed by our GIS unit to provide a more detailed look at where the proposed regulations will apply. But first, we have another polling question for you. In which areas would you like to see the wildlife ordinance applied? You can select more than one or all that apply. So feel free to select more than one or only one. Okay, I see votes still coming in, so we'll take just a few more seconds. Okay, it looks like we're still getting votes. Good. Great, it looks like everyone has had an opportunity to respond. Let's close the polls. It looks like we have a majority who supports the applying the ordinance to the entire Santa Monica mountain range, to the protected pause area, and also all the hillsides, including the rim of the valley. We have the least support for just applying it to the wildlife ordinance boundary. Thank you. And now Alex Lenz will walk you through the interactive GIS boundary map developed by our GIS unit.
Thanks, Lena. So hopefully the screen is currently showing a website with the Wildlife Ordinance District boundary. So this website, which is available on the project website that we've shared in the chat, allows viewers to scroll around and look at the area highlighted, which is our initial proposed ordinance district. The functionality of the website also allows a user to type in an address or an intersection or a landmark into this search bar that says find address. So for example, if you put in the Franklin Canyon Reservoir, the application will show you that feature, and it will show you the boundary of the ordinance district. It's also possible to adjust the base layer that you're viewing the map on and gain access to some satellite imagery that's provided by various sources through Esri, the GIS application. So that this is currently available. We encourage you to take a look at it, and again, it can be found on our website. I'm going to pause this demonstration. Here's just a quick image of that map again that we walked through. And now I would like to introduce my colleague, Kat Sukerfiski, who will give us a little bit more information about other efforts that support the wildlife ordinance from among our other commonly asked questions.
Thank you, Alex. The City of Los Angeles has many different initiatives underway to address the enhancement of habitat and biodiversity within the city and within the region. The Bureau of Sanitation and Environment, otherwise known as LA-SAN, is spearheading the creation of a Los Angeles-specific biodiversity index and has released an informative biodiversity report in both 2018 and in 2020. Both of those reports can be accessed at lacitysan.org/biodiversity. LA-SAN is also working with internal and external experts on healthy soils initiatives and on tree planting programs to increase the urban forest. More information on these efforts can be found at the web links that are being provided in the chat. Additionally, LA-SAN has recently certified Los Angeles as a community wildlife habitat through the National Wildlife Federation and is partnering with the Los Angeles Public Library on the LA BioBlitz Challenge this summer, which is going to photograph and map animals, insects, and plants that are found within our neighborhoods, local parks, hiking trails, and other natural areas. The public can attend neighborhood science programs and read from the BioBlitz book list about Los Angeles wildlife for a chance to win prizes and earn summer reading challenges. There are also a multitude of efforts underway to enhance the urban forest within the city, including the Protected Tree Ordinance and Street Tree List updates, urban forest visiting scholars work, among many others. The Department of Water and Power is also a partner of the National Power and Pollinators Initiative, which is creating a forum to share ideas and research findings and to lead innovative, collaborative conservation efforts related to pollinators and their habitat. This overview highlights just some of the many efforts that the City of Los Angeles is participating in, which are also helping to address and enhance the health of our urban ecosystem.
Thank you, Kat. I was having a little bit of audio issues before. I hope my audio is improved. This is Connie again, and we're wrapping up the staff presentation portion of the webinar. Please note we are taking feedback throughout the process, as mentioned previously, and in addition to submitting your questions this evening, you may submit written comments via email to ourla2040@lacity.org. I'll just repeat that since I garbled it. The email is ourla2040@lacity.org at any time over the next few months. This email will also be posted in the chat box in case you missed it. We will now move into the Q&A portion of our meeting. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Gabriela Juarez, who will help us this evening by facilitating our Q&A session and conducting a few more audience questions. So thank you for staying with us. We see there's still our participants who joined us earlier. We're glad you're hanging on. We're about halfway through the the meeting. So we again thank you for your time, and now we'll transition to questions and answers.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gabriela Juarez, and I'm a planner with the Department of City Planning. I'll be conducting the Q&A portion of tonight's presentation and reading a few more audience questions. Again, we would like to thank everyone for taking the time to review the proposed ordinance and join us in tonight's workshop. Just a quick refresher, we started with the recording of a staff presentation which provided an overview of the wildlife pilot study and the proposed wildlife ordinance. We moved on to staff highlighting responses to commonly asked questions, and now we'll move into the Q&A section of tonight's agenda. As a reminder, this workshop and Q&A is specific to the draft wildlife ordinance and the proposed regulations. And so that will be the focus of the questions that we respond to today. The purpose of this online workshop is to collect additional input and feedback and clarify questions about the draft wildlife ordinance as it's currently proposed. If you're looking to learn more about the wildlife pilot study or download a copy of the proposed draft, information is available on our website at planningforla.org/wildlife. That again, that's planning the number 4la.org/wildlife. This information will also be posted in the chat box. For the attendees, please note that the virtual workshop tonight will go until 7:30, and questions will be collected through the questions box, and staff will review and respond to questions as time permits. So now we should be able to see a slide that illustrates how participants can ask questions using the questions panel in GoToWebinar. Staff will receive the questions that participants enter into the chat box. I will restate the question and staff will provide a response. Please know that if you have submitted a question so far using the questions panel, your question has been received. Staff is organizing your questions, and we will ensure that we respond to as many of these questions as we can in today's session. So we're going to go ahead into our first question this evening, and that is directed, I think, to our senior city planner, Connie. Will you be extending the wildlife corridor to the Elysian Hills northwest of downtown LA?
Thank you for that first question. I think the question came in before the video was shown and before we answered some common questions, but just to repeat, the proposed ordinance is focused on the pilot study area, which is the area in the Santa Monica Mountains between the 405 and the 101. So once the proposed ordinance is adopted for this pilot study area, the intent is to expand to the other hillside areas within the city of Los Angeles. That will be a separate public process. So there will be a similar process to this where the public will be engaged in any proposal to expand the pilot. Thank you. Thank you for that question.
Thanks, Connie. Our next question, we have a participant asking, are we going to be able to make a comment tonight? Alex, would you like to answer that for us?
Yes. Well, the comments, all of the comments that are received in the chat box are being recorded, and the staff is going to make an effort to address, as many as we can during this session. But we're also continuing to receive comments on the ordinance via email, and we will continue to provide responses, including the recording of this session and additional responses to frequently asked questions moving forward in our process.
Thanks, Alex. Our next question is asking, how will this ordinance apply to existing structures? Lena, do you think you could help us with that answer?
Yeah, absolutely. So the proposed ordinance is not intended to be retroactive. It will not affect existing development, but it's intended to be applied to new construction and new additions over a certain size. Repairs and maintenance projects would be exempt from this ordinance. Thank you.
Thanks, Lena. Our next question, since birds are free to fly and thus are not confined to wildlife corridors, why would this new wildlife region be singled out for different window rules than other neighborhoods with just as many birds? Kat, you might be an expert at one of these, at addressing this. Can you help us with a window regulation response?
Sure thing. So this area definitely does have an increased amount of ecological significance. So knowing that we have a higher population of a lot of different diversity of bird species that are associated with the different natural communities that are still existing within our hillsides, it's impeccably important to create safe havens for those source populations. So areas that are still thriving with those kind of habitat types. Being able to then make sure that those habitats and those associated species are kept intact, and then able to freely move to other areas of the city as well. So making sure that we start off first and foremost with regulations that are in place for those kind of source populations is very important for maintaining those populations and making sure that they positively spread to other areas of the city as well.
Thanks, Kat. Moving on to our next question. Any guidelines or regulations against company or homeowners' use of rat or any kinds of poisons which then cause secondary injury and death to the wildlife chain? And following that up, are there any guidelines regarding not feeding wildlife, leaving pet food, and pets outside? This is very critical in these areas. Connie, can you help us with an answer here?
Yes, happy to try and answer this question. So we have definitely heard the need for rodenticide controls. Definitely have talked to a lot of residents who have asked for guidance for their neighbors and for others in the community about attracting wildlife. So this ordinance is focused on land use regulations, so controls that can be monitored and enforced by permit. Those are typically reviewed by planning and the planning department and the building and safety department. The items that people are asking for are really more behavioral adjustments. And while we might be able to partner with some of our other city departments on leading informational campaigns, those are not land use regulations. But I do understand that there are different efforts amongst different departments who are looking into some of those items like the rodenticide. So definitely real issues, but not ones that the ordinance that we are proposing can speak to. Thank you.
Thanks, Connie. That's really helpful. We're going to do a little poll here for our audience. If you can indicate your level of support for increasing permit fees to fund enforcement, please select one of the following options available to you on your screen: supportive, neutral, not supportive, not sure, I don't know. Those are our options here. We're gonna see how people are feeling right now about this issue. Is that something that our department definitely needs to consider in this effort? So go ahead and click on your option and hit submit. We're gonna wait a couple more seconds here to give people an opportunity to submit their preference at this point in the process. And just a few more seconds here to allow folks to decide and kind of evaluate the pros and cons of increasing permit fees. Alrighty, I think we can close the polls with the majority of our respondents participating. And currently we have about 60% supportive and a little bit neutral and not supportive and not sure is kind of where the rest fall. And we're going to do one more question while we have your attention on getting some feedback. Which of the proposed standards are the most important to enhance wildlife habitat and connectivity? And here you can select one or more. So you have the option of selecting just one or several of these options, including setbacks and lot coverage, slopes and grading, resource buffers, vegetation, landscaping, and fences, and the last option, lighting, windows, and trash enclosures. Again, here, this is select one or more. Feel free to take some time to think about those individual standards that you feel strongly about. And we have about half of our folks responding, so we're gonna just let folks think a little bit longer about these options. So you can select, again, one or more of these 5 options prior to hitting submit. And I think we can go ahead and close the poll with the majority of our participants responding. So we've got strong support pretty much across the board for all of these options. It seems that the highest of the respondents would like to see vegetation, landscaping, and fences definitely included in our proposed standards. And equally as important are resource buffers and setbacks and lot coverage. And just about equally as important as well is slopes and grading, along with lighting, windows, and trash enclosures. So this is really helpful for our refinement as we continue forward in this process. So I think we'll come back to some more questions now. Our next question is asking what recommendations are being made to address fire danger and fuel modification. Kat, do you think you could answer that for us?
Sure thing. So the wildlife ordinance is currently consistent with brush management, which aims to regulate the size and type of or location of vegetation. And the wildlife ordinance itself is proposing the type of vegetation to incorporate into new landscaping. Vegetation and landscaping standards included within the wildlife ordinance are aligned with LA County's brush clearance zones of A, B, and C. Any newly planted or landscaped area within the wildlife ordinance district will be required to comply with these planting zones in order to increase habitat value and resist the spread of fire. In the wildlife ordinance, planting zone A must consist of a minimum of 50% native species, and in zones B and C, it must consist of a minimum of 75% native species, chosen from the preferred plant list from Appendix B. Zone C should then blend with the existing surrounding natural vegetation and be managed in accordance with LAFD standards to facilitate firefighting. Fire-resistant hardscape features, things like stone walls and patios, decks and roadways, are also encouraged for use as burn breaks to create fire-resistant zones. The draft wildlife ordinance is attempting to balance the goals of both fire safety and native vegetation and habitat existence by creating regulations that allow for both the prohibition of invasive plant species, things like which end up increasing fuel load and fire risk, and also then through other mechanisms such as limiting building on steep hillside slopes. So this is the first articulation of how to potentially balance these various goals, and we very much look forward to receiving your feedback on this topic.
Thanks, Kat. I think getting input from our participants on this particular aspect is really crucial to helping us really get this ordinance right. Let's move on to our next question. Are the standing eucalyptus going to be spared? Kat, would you mind helping us with that answer again?
So right now,
responding to that.
Sure. So right now, as the ordinance is currently written, there is not a requirement to remove existing vegetation.
Great. That's good to know. Okay, we're going to move on to our next question. How will exceptions / relief to the ordinance be granted, and by whom, and how can we guarantee that it's not abused? Connie, do you think you can help us with an answer for this?
Sure, thank you. As the ordinance is proposed, the relief process would follow the same process that is in place today for relief requests. So things like requests for variances would be handled by the Department of City Planning and Zoning Administrator through a discretionary process.
Thank you, Connie. We're getting a lot of questions regarding resources, specifically if fully developed maps of resources is going to be provided, and if those resources are going to be defined, including golf courses. Lena, do you think you could help us with answering that question?
Yes, absolutely. So we are looking into the technology to provide a more detailed map of resource buffers, similar to the interactive boundary map that you saw earlier that Alex presented. As far as whether what is defined as a resource, resources include geologic features, water features, vegetation, animal species, wildlife corridors, and ecosystem services, which contribute to the overall quality of the natural and built environment. So it does not include golf courses. And so we will be mapping, we have mapped these features using the kind of latest data, best data available. But again, for the purpose of this ordinance, we have defined resources as ridgelines, open space, lakes, reservoirs, ponds, marshes, seeps, springs, streams, creeks, rivers, riparian areas, storm drains, and again, some of these resources that we are considering standards for may or may not be mapped. So hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Lena. I just wanted to remind folks that if you would like to view or download the draft wildlife ordinance, you can visit our website, planningforla.org/wildlife. The information to access our website and download the draft wildlife ordinance will also be posted in the chat box. And as a reminder, if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please go ahead and call our technical support, and staff will be available to answer your call and assist you, hopefully, to troubleshoot your tech issues. And this information will be posted here in the chat for you in case you need that. And then for anything that you may think of beyond tonight as you think about these issues at home or discuss them with family and neighbors, we do encourage you to send us your comments to our email, which is ourla2040@lacity.org, which is OURLA the number 2040@lacity.org, and I think we can post that in the chat as well. And so just as a summary, we have been asking audience questions during the meeting this evening. Additionally, there's a brief survey at the end of this meeting, and we invite you to take the survey to tell us a little bit about your participation experience tonight. With these announcements completed, let's continue on with a few more questions that we've gotten in the last few moments. We have a question on lighting, specifically how the ordinance addresses the brightness of outdoor lighting. Alex, is this something you can help us answer?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so there is a whole section on lighting, and that's grouped in with the information on trash enclosures and the information on bird-safe facades. But as far as lighting is concerned specifically, we are going to regulate the type of lighting. So obviously there are different light fixtures that are used to generate the light, and only certain of those will be allowed. We're going to regulate the height that those fixtures can be placed, as well as the temperature and the brightness of the lamps themselves. I think one of the most important things that we're including on the topic of lighting is directing light to be downcast, to be properly shaded, and to be directed away from the right-of-way, directed away from adjacent properties, and especially from open spaces where a lot of wildlife activity may be taking place. Because as we know, lighting can be confusing or disruptive to all sorts of animals, from insects to big mammals, and even can affect plant life. So we've heard a lot from the community about lighting issues. We've consulted with a number of subject matter experts on the topic, and we continue to work with our interagency partner, LA Department of Building and Safety, to figure out the best way to implement the lighting regulations that we're proposing.
Great, thanks, Alex. That was really helpful. Will the proposed ordinance address any noise pollution? Lena, is that a question you could help us answer?
Yes, the ordinance will not be addressing any noise.
Thank you. And then maybe a little bit of another question maybe you can help us with, Lena, is asking what steps are planned to protect wildlife from traffic on what are considered roadways?
So the planning department does not have jurisdiction over public right-of-way. So this ordinance will not apply to roadways, only private properties.
Okay, that's helpful to know. I see that we have a few questions regarding if we have consulted with other agencies, building and safety, for example, transportation agencies as well, and the sort. Connie, do you think you could help us give us the context on what's been done in that vein?
Of course, yes. We have consulted with LA Department of Building and Safety, the Department of Sanitation and Environment, We have reached out specifically to building and safety and their grading specialists, as well as the fire department. And as far as transportation agencies, we have been in contact with Caltrans, as well as others. So we have done quite a bit of internal city outreach and engagement with these departments, as well as we have consulted with environmental groups such as CLAW, the Center for Biological Diversity, the local academic experts from USC and UCLA, Occidental, and others that I unfortunately am not noting, but not because they're also very important. So just to give you a few examples of who we have consulted and tried to learn from. So it's very helpful, and it has instructed many of the regulations that are proposed here.
Thank you, Connie. While I have you fresh on your mic, we have a question asking a little bit more again about the timeline. Is it possible that you can have staff share that information again, or maybe you can share that with us?
Sure, let's see. Would it be helpful to have the slide with the timeline come back up so I can just refer to some images that might help people understand where we are? I'm trying to see if this question is asking specifically about public comment or about when the ordinance might become effective, but the ordinance itself has to go through a public process. That's the typical process that the planning department utilizes to make sure that the ordinances and rules that it puts forward are ones that are desired and will benefit the community. So thank you. The slide is up. And so we are, again, collecting public input on a draft ordinance at this moment in time. So we've spent several years, so we didn't spend too much time on the history of this, but we have spent several years developing these ordinance provisions. Also hired an environmental consultant to help us identify the areas that need the most protection that could benefit from these regulations. So all that information, in addition to initial public workshops that were held in 2018 and 2019, that all informed the development of this draft ordinance. We're now in essentially a 4 to 5 months process of vetting the ordinance with the public, getting feedback and making adjustments. So that will take place through this workshop, through a public hearing that will follow in late summer. And then the formal hearing process will continue with the City Planning Commission anticipated for late summer, fall, and then followed by the City Council as the final decision maker. So if we're looking at when the ordinance might become effective, it would be towards the end of 2021 before it can become effective. And we should also have conversations about if phase-in provisions are necessary, or if people would like to see this applied to projects as soon as it's possible. But again, one clarification that I think we previously answered was the fact that this set of regulations cannot apply retroactively. So projects that are in the pipeline currently are not subject to these regulations. So hopefully that answers the question, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, Connie, I think we're having a little interference, breaking up, but I believe that the last main point you had there is that it would not apply to projects that have already been filed. And I think if anyone still has questions or would like us to elaborate again, please feel free to email us or put it in the chat, and we will repeat in the chat if we need to. Let's move on to our next question. And the question is if you can please define wildlife corridor. Kat, do you think you could help us with that?
Sure. So there are many different ways that one can define wildlife corridor, but essentially it's a strip of habitat or open space that's connecting populations of wildlife that are otherwise essentially separated by some sort of development or cultivated land or infrastructure such as roads. And these wildlife corridors serve as they serve a number of purposes, including protecting wildlife and helping animal populations thrive, and can function as a means to decrease the human-animal conflict in the form of, vehicle-animal collisions and help combat the negative effects of habitat fragmentation that we see from development.
Thanks, Kat. Let's do a little moment of a few more poll questions for our audience tonight.
Gabriella,
Yes.
this is Connie. Sorry, I just want to take a moment. I apologize, everyone, for the technical issues. I just want to check my audio. Are you hearing me any better than before?
Yes, you're loud and clear. So thanks for the tech check.
Okay, my apologies, everyone. I hope that going forward, you'll be able to hear my responses. Gabriella, back to the polls. Thank you.
Sounds good. Let's have a poll break. Let's see if we can get the poll to come up here. If you can please select instances where you would like to see the standards apply, and here you are able to select one or more of the following. You can select them all if you'd like. Please select from additions, remodels, new accessory structures, new pools and decks, and our last option here, new landscaping and fencing. So please go ahead and consider these options for where you might like to see the standards applied for this wildlife effort. And again, you are welcome to select one or all or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 and hit submit. And we're getting about half of the respondents in, so we'll give this a few more moments. And so yes, here you have the option of selecting one or more. You can select all or none. I think none is not an option, but one or more, please. And we'll just leave this open a little bit longer. And I think a few more moments. All right, I think we can go ahead and close the poll. And from our results, so we've got landscaping and fencing is something that we could look into having standards apply. Well, all of them, obviously there's quite a good support across the board for all of these, but the top 3, well, actually the top 4 are kind of in very close proximity. So additions, new accessory structures, and new pools and decks would be optimal opportunities, it seems like, from what we're hearing tonight. Okay, so I think we have one more.
Could you try again?
We have one more poll that we can, I think, launch. And there it is. So if you could please indicate your level of support for the proposed grading restrictions. We had a very nice graphic to kind of depict these options. So we'd like to hear from you how folks feel on whether we're on point with including those in this effort. And so this is a select one and submit. So if you wouldn't mind making your choice on your preference for supporting what we're proposing in the grading restrictions for this ordinance, and then hitting submit. And a few more moments, I think, for folks to give us their response. Here you would just select one answer. And we've got almost the majority submitting response here. So a few more moments to let people ponder. Okay, it looks like we're getting everyone's feelings have been recorded. All right, let's go ahead and close the poll. And we've got about 70% in support and 20% not in support and 11 unclear, not sure, I should say. All right, so let's head back to our questions. We're getting some questions about the boundary, specifically why Griffith Park and the neighborhoods near the west side and Hollywood area are not included. Someone is also asking where they can find a copy of the boundary map that was presented. Lena, do you think you could help us answer that question?
Yep, definitely. So the proposed regulations would initially apply to the Wildlife Ordinance District, as mentioned earlier. But however, we are intending to expand to other areas in the city after successful implementation of the ordinance. And the reason why we have not, just applied it to the entire city initially is because the city is really large and hillside regulations are pretty complex. So applying the regulations to a pilot area first would essentially help ensure that regulations proposed would be effective. And in terms of providing a link to the interactive map, yes, we can provide that link in the chat box, but I believe that that link is also on our website at planning.lacity.org/wildlife.
Thank you, Lena. That was really helpful. I think now a question for Connie. Does this override all the other ordinances and regulations like baseline hillside ordinance, Mulholland specific plan, and the forthcoming ridgeline ordinance?
Thank you. So that our ordinance, the proposed ordinance in front of us this evening, is written with consideration of those existing regulations. So in the distinction that we have here is because many of those ordinances do also refer to or respond to hillside conditions. The main distinction here with the wildlife ordinance is that it is written with the express purpose of protecting wildlife, and that includes wildlife habitat and limiting disturbances to the natural vegetation that wildlife need to exist. And so the ordinance as written supersedes those ordinance provisions from those other ordinances that conflict or it's not clear. So it is intended that the wildlife regulations would be the most protective regulations.
Thanks, Connie. And could you explain what the environmental analysis for this proposed wildlife ordinance is?
Yes, that is still being determined. We are currently considering a negative declaration as these regulations are intended to be protective of the environment, but we are still determining that, and it will be determined once the ordinance provisions are more settled on. So right now we're still collecting information and comments from the public, so it depends if there are new provisions introduced or not, but that is the direction that we are going.
Thank you. We have a question about why are man-made open channels, catch basins, and public easements defined as protected natural resources when they don't actually appear to provide wildlife habitat? Kat, do you think you could help us with a response?
Sure thing. So water is an extremely essential resource for all sorts of wildlife. And water within urban areas is not just present within intact riparian ecosystems. We see these kind of things in open channels and catch basins as well. So those types of more man-made or infrastructural water features are still very much key resources and have extremely high habitat value for the wildlife that are residing and moving through urban areas. Similarly, open spaces of all sizes, including even easements, are also very key areas for wildlife to still be able to move throughout urban areas, so have also been highlighted as resources within the city.
Thanks, Lena. We have a really great question here. Maybe Connie, you can help us answer this. Does the wildlife ordinance address zoning changes from residential to commercial within the wildlife ordinance zone?
Yes, so the response to that question is no. This ordinance is not changing underlying zoning. So if your property is zoned for residential development today, it retains those underlying zones, such as R1 or RE40. If your property is zoned commercial today, C2, we are not changing that. So no changes to the underlying zone. We are adding additional restrictions that speak to wildlife protection. And I just want to note we're at the 3-minute mark, so we're thinking of taking at least one more question. We have more questions here that have been received than we're able to answer this evening. So I do want to note that we'll be following up with either additional FAQs or fact sheets, trying to respond to those questions that we didn't get to this evening. So thank you again for hanging out. We have just a few more questions to try and respond to, and I think one more poll.
Yeah, we've got a question here regarding remedial grading. The question is why remedial grading is prohibited. Lena, do you think you could help us with that response?
Yes, definitely. So just to clarify, remedial grading would not be prohibited under this ordinance. It would count towards the grading by right maximum. This means that if the by right maximum is exceeded, the applicant would need to go through a different review process. So again, just to clarify, remedial grading is not prohibited under this ordinance.
Thanks, Lena. I think that's pretty much our time tonight. And for all of you still hanging out with us, now that you've had the opportunity to learn more about the proposed ordinance, please indicate your level of support for the wildlife ordinance as it's currently written. Please select one of the following options and then hit submit. This helps us get a gauge as to where we are on the mark of getting closer to a final recommendation for consideration. So we've got about 2/3 of you all responding, still waiting a little bit longer for folks to give us their final response to this poll. We'll leave it open a few more moments. If you could make your selection and hit submit. And we're just asking for if you are supportive now that you've heard our presentation and hopefully gotten some clarification on your questions of the proposed draft as it's written. And a little bit longer for those last few that have not quite filled out the response yet. And I think we're at our time, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. So we have a majority of support for this, 20 unsupportive and 14% neutral and unsure at this point. So we're at the end of our scheduled time, and we're going to go ahead and wrap it up, and I'm going to hand it over to Connie Pelini-Tipton to close it out for us.
Yes, thanks so much, Gabriella, for being our Q&A and poll moderator. I think the responses in the poll kind of mirror what they were earlier this evening. So I'm not sure how much we were able to answer people's questions, but I hope we were, and given a little more time to digest everything, we'll continue to build support for this. So we want to thank everyone who has participated this evening. We thank you for your time. We are going to still collect comments. So again, you can email us at rla2040@LA City at any time during the review process. I want to note that all participants and interested parties who registered this evening will receive an email with this information along with future project updates. So you're being added to our mailing list. We are also going to have a copy of tonight's workshop uploaded to our project website. So I think we've repeated that, and you'll be able to go to that website shortly, probably in the next couple of weeks. So we wanted to just thank everyone again. Tonight's meeting was super well attended, and we weren't able to answer everybody's questions, but we certainly appreciate the participation, the questions received, and we will be following up with future fact sheets. And again, we thank you for your time this evening. Your participation, questions, and suggestions are very much appreciated. We hope you have a good night. Thank you again for joining us.